Well, welcome back. This is the picture, excuse me, that I've chosen to speak behind. And its year is 1971, Tucson, Arizona. That little baby boy is Jeffrey Brown, now age 61, held by my dad. And that's my grandmother Brown in the wheelchair. I think she was probably late 70s, early 80s. And that little cute little girl there is Jennifer Lynn Brown, now Jennifer Lynn Shepherd. Amazing. And the handsome fellow, of course, on the left is the attorney Kennedy Brown. That's before I left the law practice and went into real estate with my dad. Okay, so now I'm going to read this Storyworth story, which I think was probably around story 12 or 14 of the 18 I've submitted. And it's an example of how the family history can be chronicled and captured information that was never ever in one place. And this is going to be 52 chapters of family history, both on my part and Janelle's part. So it will be amazing, I think, to look back over it and see. As I said before, actually, I've been ministered to out of recalling the history that answers some of the questions. Actually, had to receive ministry myself in some areas. So anyway, they send out this question each week, and this particular week's question was, what are some of your favorite historical figures? Well, I retitled it, or gave it a title, The Long Journey to a Short List of Historical Favorites. I love history. My big problem was that for the first 70 or so years of my life, I didn't recognize it. My first remembered reading efforts, apart from school, happened around 12 years of age. At that time, my parents subscribed to the magazines of the era. It was hard to say whether Collier's or Saturday Evening Post was my favorite. There was also the monthly Reader's Digest, which ranked pretty high on the list. Unfortunately, my father's health, family finances, and World War II brought an end to these literary resources. My family was not otherwise into books. We had a set of encyclopedia, not Britannica, and maybe a family Bible. The encyclopedia garnered all my limited interest in the written word. The high school I attended, I was one of a class of 12, offered a literature class and a history class. I was somewhat captured by a brief introduction to Shakespeare. The history class, however, was mostly date learning with little context. At least that's my recollection. Law school, as I've previously recounted, was for me a reading drudgery. However, the undergraduate pre-law humanities course was probably a door opener to real literature. A required course of my bachelor's program, I took it in summer school so it didn't conflict with my core studies. That decision in hindsight was not a good decision from the standpoint of nurturing my love for books and history. I was fascinated by what I learned in the course from the secular writings accumulated through the 1,000 or so years prior to summer school in 1950. The fact that a semester's reading requirements in the course had been compressed into 5 weeks of reading exhaustion further closed the door on any fond remembrance the summer's peaks of literary pleasure the course had provided. The ROTC summer camp of 1951, my contracting of TB, the ensuing months of bed rest, my entrance into the casualty insurance business, all these things conspired to wash away any residual memory of the wonder and joy of the humanities course from my now revised life. So those stirred juices would now go dormant for many years. So jumping ahead 30 or so years, you would think my owning a bookstore may be the result of a love for books. For me, in 1986 in Gainesville, Florida, it was mostly a business decision. My wife had the love for books. I was still basically in a reading drought. Prior to the physical bookstore, we had operated what today would be an online internet bookstore. We broadcast over a local Christian radio station short, daily programs based on a book we were offering. Orders were placed to us by mail and then filled by mail. This crude system actually had a modicum of success. The radio audience grew, motivating us to create a real brick-and-mortar Christian bookstore. It continued for 10 years and ended with a profitable sale to a national chain. That sale happened in 1996, a few months before my 66th birthday. The sale not only ended the bookstore period in my life, but also my gainful employment period. I retired to pursue an entirely different agenda. Golf then began to occupy a lot of time each week. This activity continued for months. Though I worked hard at the game and at practice, it improved a little. One day, as I was driving home from a disappointing practice, I felt my thoughts interrupted by the Lord. Seems he said, "It would be a lot more profitable for you to spend the same time with me as you do practicing golf." I didn't quit the game, but my time spent at it greatly diminished. I never regretted that decision. My interest in reading began to grow. It began with the Bible. When I was born again in October 1973, I had a paperback New Testament. I clung tenaciously to John 14:23, reading it over and over, memorizing it. With the Lord's suggestion, I now began Bible reading and journaling. The Apostle John became the first historical figure on my list of favorite historical figures. Identifying those historical figures is my ultimate purpose in this writing. Just before our move from Gainesville, Florida to Tupelo, Mississippi in 2003, I acquired the Civil War book by Bruce Catton, A Stillness at Appomattox. This book may well have begun my interest in historical figures. The author introduced me to U.S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and other figures of the era with whom I would grow in intimacy over the following years. Authors like Catton, Shelby Foote, Doris Goodwin, and Jay Winnick have added detail to history's legends of these men, and especially of Abraham Lincoln, all now on my list of favorites. History, its characters, books, and authors are glued to each other, but with a caveat. You can't really know of history's players down through the centuries without books, and you can't have books without authors. So the role of the author in preserving history is essential. The caveat concerns the author. The integrity of the author is imperative for an unbiased reporting of historical events and the players involved. The author, who reflects his bias in his chronicling, does a disservice to history. How does the deceased legend obtain justice for inaccurate reporting? How does the reader ascertain the author's agenda, which is reflected in his view and reporting of history? Okay, how did I get down these trails? These trails to these unanswered questions. I'm not going to try to answer them. I'm not sure. All I started to respond to was a question as to my favorite historical figures. But before I finally address that specific topic, let me just add my thanks to technology. My interest in and appreciation of history has mostly come about because of the audiobook. The written word transcribed to audio has totally broadened my horizon and let me enjoy reading. That reading is listening, really. Now the daunting challenge of reading hundreds of pages of small font print no longer enters into the consideration as to a book's selection. Audiobooks have stirred afresh the wonder and appreciation first awakened by that humanities course, and has permitted me to have a love of history. Finally, my favorite historical figures. I've made no effort to rank them, so here they are. Alexander the Great, Teddy Roosevelt, Maimonides, Harry Truman, George Patton, Catherine the Great, the above-mentioned Civil War actors, Martin Luther, Ronald Reagan, John Adams, Winston Churchill, and of course, the apostles John, Paul, and Peter, and Lord willing, the list will grow as I have opportunity to read, that's really listen, more. Before I leave, I'll plot it to Jay Winnick. In my opinion, he is the consummate historian and author. He writes with big picture understanding and creates an intimacy of relationship with the characters. I think I have all of his books in audio and most in digital. I will often buy a digital copy of a book I have in audio to be able to reference or savor specific portions. My first Winnick book was 1944, FDR and the Year That Changed History. This book is gripping, especially in his coverage of the Holocaust. He also wrote April 1865, the month that saved America, a remarkable, comprehensive insight into the history of our country, especially the trauma of the Civil War. The most mind-blowing book was his book, The Great Upheaval, America and the Birth of the Modern World, 1788 to 1800. It was this book that opened my eyes to the French Revolution and put Catherine the Great on my list of favorites. It has been a long journey to come to this conclusion paragraph. Also, actually, I have enjoyed the exercise and insight that I have gained into me. Whether or not history is your area of interest is not as important to me as to encourage you at an early age to engage in reading, whether print or audio. I suggest you work on the print skill. I would work on that skill if I could start over on my learning journey. And with that, I conclude the mission I embarked upon some 1,300 words ago. And that was my Storyworth submission for that question. Gives you a flavor of what Storyworth can offer. So I hope you enjoyed it. And as I said, I think in the first YouTube, if you would like to have more Storyworth information, let me know. And if I recommend you to